Good afternoon, teachers. Today I want to do a quick wrap-up, do the second part of the GDP lesson from the last video. This one should be relatively short, but we need to cover a couple more things about GDP before we can move on to the business cycle, and then eventually move on to real GDP, hopefully somewhere around the end of the week. So I want to do a real quick video kind of wrapping up some of the big concepts about GDP that the kids need to know, in addition to what we covered when we covered the circular flow diagram. So essentially what I want to do with this lesson today is hit a couple of big things the AP exam will try to trick the kids on. So topic number one we're going to cover is what isn't added to GDP. So we need to make some lists of things that don't get calculated in there so that the kids know not to add them in if they're given a list of things and asked to calculate GDP. From then we're going to cover what are some things that should be counted toward GDP but in reality actually aren't for various reasons. And then we'll wrap this up with a brief discussion of what the limitations of using GDP as an economic indicator are, and talk a little bit about some of the good things and bad things about GDP kind of as an indicator in and of itself. So if you'll stick with me here real quick, let's run through what isn't added to GDP. So the first big thing that doesn't get added to GDP that I like to point out to the kids is anything that's considered a purely financial transaction. And I basically tell the kids that anything that's just an exchange of money or an exchange of numbers on one bank's computer screens with another bank's computer screens that doesn't actually produce a tangible good or service does not add to GDP. And so at this point, it's important to understand that GDP is the total value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in a year. So something like getting $5 for your birthday doesn't produce a final good or service, and therefore it doesn't add to GDP. The most common things that kids will see that don't add to GDP would be things like purchases of stock on the stock market. So if I buy 3 shares of Apple stock, nothing actually got produced, so that doesn't add to GDP. The same for the bond markets, and also any form of government transfer payments also don't add to GDP. So when grandma gets a check from Social Security, or if you get a check for unemployment, these things don't produce a tangible good or service, and so they don't add to GDP. It is probably a good idea to point out to the kids that when those transfers are used to purchase something, they will then add to GDP. So if grandma takes her Social Security check and goes out and buys a, Blue Plate Special, that will certainly add to GDP, but the transfer of the money itself doesn't add to GDP. The second big thing we like to keep out of GDP to prevent any kind of double counting are any form of second-hand goods. So it's important that the kids understand that an item gets added to GDP at one point and only one point in its life. And that is the very first time that it is sold to the consumer. So any goods that have already been sold to the consumer and are being resold don't add to GDP. This could be something like a used car, a product that they're purchasing on eBay. All of these things that are second-hand goods do not add to GDP a second time because they've already added to GDP the first time. I think the most common way this is tested is through the purchase of a house. If you buy a house that was built in 1976 today, it does not add to today's GDP. It already added to GDP in the year that it was produced. So make sure that used goods, secondhand goods, don't get added into GDP. The third major category of goods, and this is a huge category for the United States, are going to be imported goods. So since we're measuring the value of final goods and services produced in an economy in a year, GDP basically cares about the territorial borders of your nation. And so since imported goods were not produced within the territorial borders of your nation, they're not going to add to your country's GDP. And this is why when we calculated net exports in the previous video, it was X minus M. So what's going to happen is if I go to the store and I buy an imported good, it's initially going to add to consumer spending, but we're going to subtract the value of that import back out at the end of the equation when we subtract out the value of import. So at the end of the day, it doesn't actually add to GDP when you purchase goods that aren't made here in the United States. Last but not least, and probably the most complicated, is that intermediate goods do not add to GDP. So the only time we add a product to GDP is the first time that it is sold to the final consumer. So anything that's kind of in the middle of production, we're not going to add to GDP. So an intermediate good is a product that is an input into the production of something else. The classic example would be if a Ford factory purchases tires from Goodyear, those tires do not add to GDP when Ford purchases them, because the value of those tires is going to add to GDP when the final car is sold, and we don't want to double count those tires. So we don't want to count the value of the tire and the value of all the other parts of the car, and then count the car itself, or we'd be double counting all the individual pieces here. So any product that is going to become part of another product before it's sold, basically products that are inputs into something else, those are not final goods and services. They're considered intermediate goods, and intermediate goods do not add to GDP. A couple of years back, the AP exam asked a related question to this about what's called the value-added approach to GDP. This is another way to think about intermediate goods, which is that each stage of production adds a value, right? So when the tires and the starters and all the car parts and the aluminum and the steel go into the Ford factory, they have one value, but when they leave the Ford factory as a finished product, they have more value. So this is what's called the value-added approach. I wouldn't spend a lot of time on this, but because the AP exam has asked, if the AP exam asks them about the value-added approach here, basically what you're going to add up is all the value added at each stage, which, long story short, just means that you just subtract out the value of intermediate goods, and you'll end up with what's called the value added. The next part of the lesson I want to move on to then is kind of figuring out what are some things that should be added to GDP, but for one reason or another don't actually get added. And this is where I like to talk about black and gray market transactions. And you'll probably need to define these for the kids. They have some idea what black market is, but you may want to go ahead and define it. So for the purposes of our lesson here, a black market transaction is an illegal transaction that doesn't get reported to the government. Probably the most common thing that will happen to the black market transactions is the production of illegal drugs. So I'll always use kind of Breaking Bad as an example here. In Breaking Bad, Walter White is creating a product. He's creating a product, in this case crystal meth, within the territorial borders of the United States, and that product has value. So technically speaking, we should be able to add the value of all those drugs that he's producing to our GDP. It is a final good or service produced in our economy in a year, and we should be able to track that. However, because drug dealers and drug producers, generally speaking, don't report their income to the government and don't report how many pounds of crystal meth they make, these transactions become almost impossible to actually add. So technically speaking, we should be adding the value of these things in, but we don't actually, because we don't really have a good way to go about figuring out exactly how much is being produced and to account for that. Now, this isn't really a problem for an economy the size of the United States, where these black market transactions make up a relatively small percentage of GDP. But if we're attempting to calculate GDP for a country like Afghanistan or a country like Colombia, where black market transactions make up a vast percentage of their GDP, we're going to have to do a little bit of guesswork to figure out exactly how much they're producing, because without them, their GDP number is going to be very, very small. So there are some countries where the lack of black market transactions actually makes a difference. It doesn't really make a big difference for us, but for some countries it certainly does. Related to black market transactions are gray market transactions. The big difference here is that gray market transactions are legal transactions, but they're legal transactions that take place through a non-conventional means. Basically, it's a transaction that takes place in a way that the government's not actually going to be able to count it. Your classic example would be, the neighborhood kid who mows your lawn for 20 bucks. It is legal for him to mow your lawn. It is legal for you to pay him $20 in cash. But because that kid is not reporting the earnings on his income taxes, the government has no way to track the amount of services that he provides. And so although technically speaking that is a service produced in this country this year, that form of gray market transaction is not going to get added to GDP, even though technically speaking it should. I'll also like to point out to kids that stay-at-home moms provide an invaluable service. Childcare is extremely expensive, as many people know. So being a stay-at-home mom, you're providing a service. It has value, and it should, technically speaking, be added to GDP, but I don't know a lot of stay-at-home moms that bill their husbands, or stay-at-home dads who bill their wives, and since there's no billing going on and there's no claiming of those services on the income taxes, the government's not actually going to add it to GDP, even though, if we want to be 100% accurate, technically speaking, we actually should. So last but not least, I want to talk about some of the limitations of GDP as an indicator. So as I believe I said in the last video, this particular unit's all about economic indicators. So primary three are going to be GDP, inflation, and unemployment. Now, GDP is the biggest and most commonly used indicator, but it's not the have-all, be-all, end-all of economic indicators. It's good for some things and not really good for others. So let's cover really briefly what are three limitations of using GDP that we can kind of solve by having some other indicators and adding some other indicators into the mix. The first big limitation is something I think we just talked about, which is that GDP actually underestimates real productivity. Because there's a lot of stuff going on in your economy and a lot of productivity that isn't getting added to GDP, you're always going to get a slightly pessimistic view of the amount of actual work and the amount of actual goods and services your economy is producing. So you want to keep in mind the number you get for GDP is always going to be a little bit low, in some cases by a couple of percentage points, and in some cases by substantially more. Another potential pitfall of GDP is that occasionally GDP can be what's called a lagging indicator, because these GDP numbers that we get are going to be revised again and again and again over the next year or two. So the number that we get today might actually not be 100% accurate. So when we're looking at GDP growth, let's say in the last quarter, this is telling me what happened to the economy in the past, but it doesn't really tell me what's happening to the economy right now. So many of the indicators we use in eco are lagging indicators. It'll tell us what happened in the recent past, but not what's currently occurring, and GDP is one example of that. So if I see that GDP fell last quarter, I know that at some point in the last 3 months, GDP went down. I have no idea what's happening to GDP today, and nor is there really any way to figure that out. I mean, I might be able to make some projections, but it's not up to the minute 100% accurate for what's going on by the time you actually get the numbers. Last but not least, GDP is kind of a broad, kind of a blunt instrument when it comes to economic indicators. I liken it to going to the doctor and saying that you're sick, and the first thing they do is take your temperature. GDP is exactly like that. It'll tell you whether things are going well in the economy or not, but it doesn't have the ability to tell you exactly what's going on. So I know if GDP is falling, we're going into a recession, but the GDP number by itself won't actually tell me why we're going into a recession, and certainly won't tell me how to go about fixing the problem. So it's good because it gives you, a status report, is the economy healthy? But at the same time, it doesn't tell you what's wrong, and so we need other indicators, especially inflation and unemployment, to try and narrow down the usual suspects and try to figure out exactly what's going on when things are going poorly, and more importantly, how to go about fixing them. So these are a couple of things I'd like to add to the end of the GDP lesson. Hopefully this is helpful for you. Have a good day.